The Boeing 737 roared down the runway, lifting gracefully into the sky as the sun dipped low, painting the horizon with streaks of gold and crimson. Inside, the cabin vibrated with the low hum of the engines. Business travelers tapped away on laptops, parents coaxed fussy children into temporary silence, and elderly couples held hands, heads resting against the window. Emily Foster, 17, sat in row 17, wedged between a nervous woman gripping her seat and a teenage boy absorbed in a video game. She had her earbuds in, music lulling her into a sense of routine calm. But even the soft melodies couldn't drown out the underlying tension of the plane as it ascended into the clouds. Emily's eyes wandered across the cabin, taking in the people around her, the businessman nervously adjusting his tie, the young mother whispering encouragements to her daughter, the elderly man closing his eyes as if preparing for the hours ahead. She'd always been fascinated by planes, not just the machines themselves, but the way people behaved under the strange alchemy of altitude and artificial flight. There was a certain vulnerability in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement that up here, 30,000 feet above the earth, you were at the mercy of forces far greater than yourself. Her gaze drifted to the cockpit door. She had spent countless hours with her father, a retired Air Force pilot, learning about controls, switches, and instruments. Just as a hobby, she had memorized the basics of takeoff, landing, and emergency procedures, though she never imagined she would ever need them. Today, that knowledge was just a comforting shadow behind her ears. Emily leaned back in her seat, trying to settle into the rhythm of the flight, the hum of the engines, a soothing pulse against the silence of the high-altitude sky. Suddenly, the plane shuddered. Not the usual minor bumps of turbulence, but a deep, bone-rattling jolt that sent the cup of coffee in the row ahead spilling onto a passenger's lap. The cabin lights flickered briefly. Murmurs rippled through the passengers. Flight attendants' eyes darted toward the cockpit door, their professional calm strained, muscles tense. Something was wrong. The reassuring voice of the captain over the intercom, a sound usually so grounding, never came. Emily's stomach sank. Her earbuds slipped from her ears, forgotten. Around her, passengers whispered anxiously, glances exchanged like unspoken questions. "What's happening?" someone muttered. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, attempting to calm panicked passengers. Their smiles were tight, eyes darting toward the cockpit every few seconds, betraying their worry. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Then, as if on cue, the cockpit door rattled violently. The sound made several passengers jump. Everyone in the immediate rows craned their necks to look, trying to catch a glimpse of the pilots. Nothing. Silence. The rattling stopped, leaving only the low hum of the engines, but the hum felt hollow, distant, as if the plane itself were holding its breath. The passengers' eyes widened. The flight attendants tried to project calm, but their hands trembled slightly as they gestured for people to stay seated. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. Something deep inside her stirred, a mixture of fear, recognition, and instinct. She remembered the countless hours spent in flight simulators with her father, memorizing switches and dials, imagining herself navigating through storms and emergencies. The thought that now some unknown calamity might require those skills sent a chill down her spine. Her palms became clammy. She could feel the vibration of the plane under her fingertips, subtle shifts that spoke to a pilot's instinct, a rhythm of the aircraft that only someone familiar could feel. A passenger 2 rows ahead began to cough violently, breaking the tense silence. Another child whimpered, clutching a stuffed animal like a lifeline. Emily noticed that the co-pilot's headset lay abandoned on the side console, swinging slightly with the subtle movements of the plane. A creeping dread spread through her. The pilot's voice should have come, issuing calm instructions or explanations. But there was nothing, just the emptiness of the cockpit, the humming engines, and the growing fear among the passengers. "Is there anyone up there?" a man shouted from the back, his voice cracking. Several passengers echoed the sentiment, their faces pale, eyes wide. The flight attendants exchanged anxious glances but remained in their positions, their professional training battling the instinctive fear rising in their chests. The plane's automated voice chimed briefly, a reminder of altitude and cabin pressure, but it did nothing to ease the panic. It only emphasized the absence of human guidance. Emily's mind raced. Every scenario she had ever imagined in a simulator flashed before her eyes. Engine failure, loss of control, emergency landing. Her fingers itched toward the seat next to her, her body trembling. She had never truly flown a real plane, but she understood controls in theory, enough to possibly make a difference if the worst happened. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Fear is natural, Emily. Panic is the enemy. You must feel the plane, not think it." The murmurs of the passengers escalated into nervous shouting. Phones were raised to record the moment, capturing every tense second. Flight attendants struggled to calm the children who were now crying openly, parents holding them tightly. The plane's slight wobble became noticeable even to untrained eyes. The pilots were still absent. The intercom remained dead. Emily's gaze returned to the cockpit door. Her heart hammering, she noticed the small panel above it, a red indicator light flashing, an emergency alert. The rattle from earlier had not been accidental. Something had gone catastrophically wrong. She swallowed hard. The adrenaline coursing through her veins was like fire, her mind hyper-aware of every detail, the tilt of the wings, the subtle vibration of the fuselage, the faint smell of overheated electronics from the cockpit. She felt a surge of responsibility she wasn't ready for but could not ignore. The plane lurched slightly again, this time enough to send a bag sliding down the aisle. Gasps echoed through the cabin. Passengers gripped the armrests, some muttering prayers, others staring wide-eyed at the ceiling. The flight attendants called out, attempting to maintain order, their voices strained but authoritative. Emily's eyes were locked on the cockpit door, every nerve screaming at her to move forward, to do something, anything. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the door rattled again. Harder this time. A sound like a warning, a heartbeat in metal. Passengers froze, all eyes swinging toward the front of the cabin. The murmurs turned into collective panic. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The door creaked as if resisting unseen hands. And then, in the strangest mix of fear and inevitability, Emily's hand, trembling violently, moved toward the handle. Every instinct told her not to. Every part of her screamed that she was too young, too inexperienced, too unqualified. Yet another part, deeper and more urgent, told her that if she didn't act, no one else would. She felt the weight of the lives around her pressing into her chest. She was just a passenger in row 17. But the plane, the people, the situation, they all demanded something impossible. Her fingers touched the cold metal handle. The rattling stopped. Silence enveloped the cabin. The passengers leaned forward, collectively holding their breath as Emily braced herself. This was it, the moment that would change everything. The door creaked open slowly. She could see the cockpit now, a landscape of blinking lights, floating switches, and the empty pilot seat staring back at her. And then the unimaginable hit her. There was no one at the controls. No one. Emily took a shaky step forward. The door swung fully open. The cockpit was hers to enter. The engine's low hum was the only sound. Her heart thundered in her chest. The weight of reality pressed down. She could fail. She could succeed. But at this moment, the lives of everyone in the cabin rested on her next move. And with that, Emily Foster, a 17-year-old girl, fully grasped the yoke. The passengers gasped collectively, some clutching each other, some silently praying as Emily's hands settled over the controls. She took a deep, shuddering breath. The plane drifted slightly to the left. She felt the first true surge of fear, sharp, cold, and undeniable. The cockpit was alive with warning lights and red alerts, each one a threat to every soul aboard. And in that frozen instant, Emily understood one terrifying fact. She was now the pilot. The plane hung in the balance at 30,000 feet, silent except for the thrumming engines and the collective heartbeat of the passengers. And then, a subtle shiver ran through the aircraft, as if testing its new captain. Emily gritted her teeth, fingers trembling, knowing the first decision she made could mean life or death. The hum of the plane became deafening. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly, a mix of orange twilight and darkening clouds. Inside, a girl in row 17 sat on the edge of panic and courage, ready to do the impossible. The world below was distant and fragile, and in that suspended, terrifying moment, the cabin held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Emily's palms were slick with sweat as she gripped the yoke. Every instinct screamed at her to back away, to flee from the cockpit that had become the epicenter of terror. But she couldn't. Not when 37 lives, including her own, were depending on her. The hum of the engines was deafening in her ears now, and every flickering light on the instrument panel seemed to shout a silent warning. This is no simulation. From the cabin came muffled screams and cries. Flight attendants were doing their best to maintain order, but panic was contagious. Children clutched their parents with desperate strength, some shaking, others quiet with fear. Emily could hear phones buzzing as passengers attempted to call emergency services, though she knew in her gut that no help would arrive in time. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her trembling fingers. Her eyes swept over the cockpit instruments, gauges, and blinking lights, a chaotic orchestra of warnings. One engine was giving off warning signals, fluctuating RPMs, smoke indicator flickers, and low oil pressure alerts. The other engine was functioning but barely, and the autopilot had disengaged entirely. This was beyond what any simulation could prepare her for. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat and remembered her father's words. "When you're up there, trust the plane. Trust yourself. Think, then act, but never hesitate." Her fingers hovered over the throttle. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. She had watched countless flight tutorials, absorbed emergency manuals, memorized key control functions. But now, faced with reality, theory felt useless. Still, she knew hesitation was deadly. Taking a shaky breath, she nudged the throttle forward just slightly, feeling the vibrations transmit through the plane. It shuddered under her hands, the engines whining in protest. From the cabin, a terrified voice rang out. "She's doing something, she's actually in the cockpit." Others screamed, a mix of disbelief and terror. Emily could feel the weight of their gazes on her back. Every eye in the plane was silently pleading, "Don't fail us." Her heart raced. She glanced at the altimeter, 30,000 feet. The plane was starting to tilt slightly left. A minor correction was needed, but every movement had consequences. One wrong adjustment could send the plane into an uncontrollable dive. She adjusted the yoke gently, her hands trembling. The plane responded, but only partially. A violent shudder ran through the fuselage, throwing a bag from the overhead compartment into a passenger's lap. Emily's stomach flipped. Cabin lights flickered as the aircraft wobbled. The flight attendants shouted for passengers to remain calm, their professional poise cracking with tension. Emily took another deep breath and tried to think logically. Focus on the basics: altitude, speed, attitude. Keep the wings level. Suddenly, the plane lurched violently. Passengers screamed, gripping armrests and each other. A flight attendant yelled, "Brace, brace." Emily instinctively leaned into the yoke, pulling gently but firmly to counter the tilt. The plane responded, but not as smoothly as she hoped. Warning lights flashed, a siren blared from the control panel, and the engine gauges began to spike. She had never felt such a surge of adrenaline. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure the passengers could hear it. The turbulence was only the beginning. A storm front loomed ahead, dark clouds curling ominously against the setting sun. Lightning split the sky in jagged, brilliant streaks. The plane rocked again, violently this time, tossing a soda can across the aisle and sending loose objects clattering. The passengers clung together, tears streaming down faces, whispering prayers they didn't even know they believed. Emily's stomach dropped. This wasn't just a technical failure, it was nature testing her resolve. And she had to fight to keep everyone alive. A thought struck her. The landing would be impossible unless she stabilized the plane first. She had seen emergency landing simulations on her father's computer, but all of them assumed a functioning co-pilot, communication with ground control, and operational instruments. None of that applied here. Emily's mind raced as she analyzed the indicators in front of her. Airspeed was fluctuating dangerously. The engine warning lights demanded attention. She had to make critical decisions now. There was no margin for error. Sweat stung her eyes as she adjusted the flaps, trying to maintain balance. The plane responded slowly. A violent shudder ran through the cabin again, making passengers cry out. Emily realized that minor corrections were amplifying the instability. Every instinct told her to pull back, to let go, but her father's voice echoed in her mind. Control what you can, adapt to what you can't. She clenched her jaw and focused on the immediate. Maintain altitude, prevent further tilting, stabilize speed. From the cabin came a high-pitched shriek. A young child had fallen partially out of a seatbelt, and the mother's panic added to the cacophony. Flight attendants rushed down the aisle, helping passengers, their voices strained but controlled. Emily's hands were glued to the yoke, and yet she couldn't ignore the chaos behind her. She had to compartmentalize, focus entirely on the aircraft. The weight of responsibility was crushing, but she had no choice. If she wavered for even a second, the consequences would be fatal. Then another sudden lurch. The plane dipped sharply, almost tipping. A collective scream erupted from the cabin. Emily's stomach lurched. She pulled back on the yoke, countering the tilt, her knuckles white, her muscles screaming in protest. The engines groaned, smoke curling faintly from one vent. Her mind raced. If one engine fails completely, they're done. There's no margin for error. Every flick of a switch, every movement of the throttle could mean survival or death. Her thoughts snapped to an emergency protocol her father had drilled into her during simulation sessions. If you lose one engine, adjust the thrust ratio, stabilize the aircraft, and alert ground control immediately. Ground control, the radio. She reached for the communication panel, fumbling slightly with the switches. Her hands shook violently. The intercom crackled to life, but only static answered. Panic surged again, stronger than before. She pressed the microphone harder, shouting, "Mayday! Mayday, I'm alone in the cockpit. Mayday!" Static silence. Her heart raced. The plane continued to drift slightly downward, altitude decreasing at an alarming rate. Emily realized the gravity of the situation. She had no guidance, no autopilot, one engine failing, storm ahead, and passengers counting on her. Her fingers hovered over the throttle, making micro-adjustments, trying to coax the aircraft into stability. Each second stretched into eternity. Then the plane shuddered violently again, throwing a tray table into the lap of a screaming passenger. Emily's vision blurred with sweat and adrenaline. She gritted her teeth and forced herself to focus. The passengers' eyes were on her now. She could feel their collective fear pressing in on her, demanding that she succeed. For the first time in her life, she realized what it truly meant to carry the weight of dozens of lives on your shoulders. A violent lightning bolt flashed outside, illuminating the cabin in stark white. The plane rocked, the nose dipping dangerously. Emily adjusted the yoke, pulling back with all her strength, feeling the vibrations and shudders of the aircraft through her arms. She could almost hear her father's calm voice over the storm. "Feel the plane, Emily. Become one with it. Don't fight it, guide it." The plane responded slowly, painfully. The shuddering lessened. The tilting eased. She allowed herself the tiniest flicker of hope, but there was no time to relax. The storm was still ahead, the engine warnings persistent, and the runway still miles away. She could hear the trembling breaths of passengers, the rustling of seat belts, the distant wails of children. Emily's hands shook, but she kept her eyes on the instruments, calculating, adjusting, balancing. Every decision was a gamble with life itself. Every second could be the difference between survival and disaster. And then, through the haze of fear and adrenaline, she caught a glimpse of lights ahead, faint but visible. The airport. They were approaching the city. The runway existed, but could she reach it in one piece? Could she stabilize the plane enough to attempt a landing? The cabin murmurs rose again, tense and anxious. Emily swallowed hard, focusing on the horizon, guiding the plane, whispering to herself, "You can do this. You have to." Her fingers gripped the yoke, her knuckles white, eyes wide. The storm clouds loomed, lightning slicing the sky, thunder shaking the plane. Every instrument flashed, beeped, or warned. She knew the worst was yet to come. And in that instant, one thought burned into her mind. The landing will be impossible unless she somehow pulls this off. Emily's hands were trembling, but she refused to let go. The yoke felt like an extension of her body, a foreign weight she had never truly handled, until now. Every flicker of the instrument panel, every vibration through the fuselage, spoke to her in a language she had only half understood until this moment. The plane was alive beneath her fingers, and if she didn't act decisively, it would betray her. Lightning cracked outside the cockpit windows, illuminating the twisted clouds like jagged mirrors. The plane shuddered violently, dropping hundreds of feet in seconds. Passengers screamed. Flight attendants gripped railings and shouted instructions, but fear coursed through the cabin like wildfire. Emily's stomach twisted. She took a deep, shuddering breath and reminded herself, control what you can, adapt to what you can't. The engine on the left sputtered, smoke curling faintly from its vent. Red warning lights blared relentlessly. The other engine was straining, groaning under the weight of the aircraft. Emily's fingers hovered over the throttle. One wrong adjustment and the plane would tilt, spiral, or worse. She took another breath and nudged the throttle forward, then slowly back, monitoring the gauges as the plane began to respond, but unevenly. A violent lurch nearly threw her forward. Her knuckles were white, her heart hammering in her chest. She glimpsed the passengers through the cockpit window, faces pale, some crying, some praying, some frozen with disbelief. They were all counting on her. The responsibility threatened to crush her, but she forced herself to focus on the fundamentals. Keep the wings level, stabilize speed, maintain altitude. Emily reached instinctively for the autopilot. In a normal flight, it would have been her lifeline, but the system was offline, dead, unresponsive. She was flying entirely by hand, a teenager in row 17 suddenly elevated to the role of a captain in the most critical situation of her life. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, calm and steady. Feel the plane, don't fight it, guide it. She tried to center herself, feeling the subtle vibrations through the controls, listening to the engine's protests, and sensing the wind pressure through the fuselage. The plane shuddered again as a bolt of lightning struck nearby, sending a jolt of panic through the cabin. Emily instinctively pulled back on the yoke, stabilizing the descent. The altimeter steadied momentarily, but the plane was still tilting slightly to the left. Sweat streamed down her forehead, stinging her eyes, but she refused to look away. She had to see every detail. The instruments, the horizon, the approach toward the city lights below. Her mind raced. The airport was visible now, a ribbon of tiny lights in the chaos of the storm. She tried to keep the aircraft level as turbulence battered the plane from all sides. The left engine's sputtering grew louder, smoke trailing like a warning. She nudged the throttle again, balancing delicately, coaxing the plane forward while trying not to overcorrect. Every minor adjustment sent tremors through the cabin, tossing passengers and luggage alike. A passenger screamed, clutching her child. Another shouted for God. Emily's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to focus. She was the only one who could prevent disaster. The storm outside seemed endless, the dark clouds swirling like a living, malevolent entity. Lightning lit the horizon in jagged bursts. Thunder shook the plane, rattling the instruments. Emily had never faced such fear in her life, but she also had never felt more alive, more driven to survive. The plane lurched violently again, tipping dangerously. Emily pulled back sharply, fighting gravity and momentum. The aircraft responded, but slowly, unevenly. Red warning lights flared again. A quick glance at the engine panel told her the left engine was failing entirely. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced it down. Focus, she told herself. One step at a time. One adjustment at a time. She couldn't let the fear control her. She had to control the plane. She glanced at the radio. She had to try contacting anyone on the ground again. Her voice shook as she shouted, "Mayday, Mayday, this is Flight 842. We have an emergency. The pilot is incapacitated. I'm in the cockpit alone." Static answered. Silence. The realization hit her. She was completely alone in navigating this disaster. Sweat poured down her face as the plane continued to pitch and wobble. She knew she had to act quickly. She had watched countless emergency landing simulations, memorized throttle adjustments, flap deployment sequences, and descent strategies. Now it all had to be executed perfectly, or everyone would die. Her hands moved almost automatically, following patterns drilled into her mind, adjusting flaps, nudging throttles, centering the yoke. A violent burst of wind slammed against the fuselage, tilting the aircraft sideways. Emily fought against it, correcting gradually, her focus entirely on the instruments and the approaching city lights. Below, the airport runway seemed impossibly small, a thread of light in a storm-ravaged night. She realized that stabilizing the plane was only the first challenge. Landing would be another, even more harrowing ordeal. Through the haze of fear, Emily caught sight of the co-pilot's headset, abandoned on the console. Her mind flashed to a moment with her father teaching her how to interpret the gauges. She leaned forward, scanning the altimeter, speedometer, and attitude indicators. The plane's nose dipped slightly. She adjusted with the yoke. The aircraft leveled, then tilted the other way. Each motion was a battle between physics, mechanics, and human error. A sudden jolt sent her headset flying, tangling her hair. A bolt of lightning illuminated the cabin, revealing terrified faces pressed against windows, gripping the armrests. Flight attendants shouted for calm, but their voices were trembling. Emily clenched her teeth and continued to guide the aircraft. She knew she had to maintain altitude and speed while lining up for the runway, a task that required skill, instinct, and nerves of steel. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Every vibration, every tremor through the plane tested her resolve. She could feel the passengers' fear, the unspoken hope radiating from their faces, anchoring her determination. The runway lights below were growing larger, brighter, a beacon of salvation, but the storm was relentless. Thunder crashed, shaking the fuselage. Rain pelted the windows in violent sheets, reducing visibility almost to zero. Emily adjusted the flaps again, fine-tuning the descent. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Think of the plane as an extension of yourself. Every movement matters. Stay calm. She forced herself to breathe, to move deliberately, to stay present in the moment. The plane responded gradually. The tilt corrected. The descent slowed. She allowed herself the tiniest flicker of hope, but knew better than to relax. Suddenly, another warning light flashed, oil pressure dropping on the right engine. Her stomach dropped. One engine was already failing. The other was now on the verge. She had to act fast. Hands flying over the console, she monitored every gauge, balancing thrust and adjusting pitch with micro-movements, coaxing the plane toward equilibrium. Every second mattered, every decision life or death. The turbulence seemed to intensify, tossing the aircraft like a toy. Emily gritted her teeth, forcing her focus inward. She could hear passengers muttering prayers, crying, holding each other. Flight attendants scrambled to secure the cabin, shouting instructions. Emily's knuckles whitened on the yoke. Her heart raced. Sweat stung her eyes, but she didn't let panic take her. She had to fight. She had to survive. Through a break in the clouds, she glimpsed the runway, a thin line of light cutting through the darkness. Relief surged, but fear remained. The engines were unstable. The storm still raged. Passengers were terrified. Every instinct told her she wasn't ready, but there was no alternative. She had to land this plane. She had to survive. She had to save them all. And then a violent lurch pitched the plane violently to the right. Emily's stomach dropped. Warning lights flared again. Passengers screamed. The aircraft seemed to fight her at every turn. Her hands moved instinctively, guided by adrenaline and memory, coaxing the plane back into level flight. Sweat dripped from her forehead, her heart pounding like a drum. She forced herself to breathe, focusing on the runway now visible in the distance. Emily Foster, 17 years old, sitting in row 17, had stabilized the aircraft enough to attempt an approach. But the storm wasn't finished. The engines were failing. The turbulence was unrelenting. And the runway, though now visible, felt impossibly distant. Every passenger in the plane looked to her, and she realized that the next few minutes would determine whether they lived or died. She tightened her grip on the yoke, whispering a desperate prayer, "Please, let me make it." The runway lights glimmered in the distance like a fragile promise. Emily's heart hammered against her ribcage, her breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. The storm wasn't relenting. Lightning flashed, illuminating the chaotic cabin and the darkened clouds beyond the cockpit windows. Rain hammered the fuselage in relentless sheets, each drop sounding like tiny explosives against the metal. The plane lurched violently. Emily's knuckles whitened on the yoke as she fought to stabilize it, her mind racing faster than she could speak. Passengers were gripping armrests, faces pale, eyes wide. Children screamed and cried into their parents' shoulders, who whispered desperate prayers. Flight attendants tried to maintain calm, shouting instructions, their voices barely audible over the storm's roar and the mechanical protests of the struggling plane. Emily stole a glance at them through the cockpit glass. They believed in her. That faith pressed down on her chest like a weight, but it also ignited a spark she didn't know she possessed. The left engine, already failing, sputtered again, sending a thin wisp of smoke curling toward the cockpit window. Red lights flashed, sirens blared. The right engine groaned under the increasing strain. Emily adjusted the throttle, nudging it carefully. The plane responded sluggishly, but it responded. She allowed herself the briefest flicker of hope before fear clawed back into her chest. She was not out of danger, far from it. Her eyes darted between the instruments and the horizon. She had memorized emergency procedures countless times in simulations with her father, but simulations never shook the plane violently with 37 terrified passengers inside, never drowned out the whine of failing engines, never forced her to make life-or-death decisions in real time. Yet here she was, gripping the yoke like her life depended on it, because it did. "Keep her level," she whispered to herself, voice tight, almost a prayer. The plane tilted again, rolling slightly. Emily yanked the yoke left, then adjusted the rudder pedals, trying to compensate for the uneven thrust. The cabin lurched, sending bags tumbling and passengers sliding against seatbelts. She could hear crying, praying, gasps of terror. One wrong move, one delayed reaction, and the aircraft could spiral into catastrophe. The storm outside intensified. Lightning flashed just beyond the runway, illuminating the turbulent night. Rain obscured the landing lights, making them appear as faint, wavering threads. Emily's stomach churned as she fought to maintain the proper glide slope. She needed to descend steadily, keep the plane stable, and prepare for landing. But every gust of wind, every tilt of the wings threatened to undo her efforts. A violent shudder ran through the plane. The left engine coughed and sputtered violently, smoke now thicker and acrid. Emily's stomach dropped. The aircraft's nose dipped. She had to act fast. Instinct and memory kicked in. She adjusted the throttle on the right engine, nudged the yoke, and deployed the flaps carefully. The plane responded, gradually leveling, but barely. Sweat stung her eyes, and she wiped it away with the back of her sleeve. The cockpit lights reflected on her tear-streaked face. "Brace!" a flight attendant shouted from the cabin. Emily's attention snapped back to the approach. She had to line the plane up with the runway, keep the speed under control, and avoid stalling, all while one engine was failing and the other was strained to its limits. The instruments blinked warnings, each one a heartbeat of danger. She whispered her father's mantra, "Feel the plane, don't fight it, guide it." She felt the vibrations, sensed the pull, and slowly coaxed the plane toward alignment with the runway. The turbulence intensified again. The aircraft rocked violently. Passengers screamed, some clutching children, others gripping armrests so tightly their knuckles turned white. The plane tilted, forcing Emily to react instantly. She adjusted the ailerons, nudged the yoke, shifted her weight. The plane responded, but not as smoothly as she hoped. She felt the full force of the storm pressing against the fuselage, threatening to overturn all her careful corrections. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning struck close, illuminating the runway with a blinding flash. Emily's heart leaped. The lights were visible, she was lined up. But there was no time to celebrate. The left engine was dying. The plane pitched slightly, the nose dipping dangerously. A siren screamed, the flaps vibrated, and the aircraft groaned under strain. Emily's hands shook as she nudged the throttle forward, coaxing the remaining engine to compensate. A child screamed from the cabin. A mother sobbed. Flight attendants shouted instructions over the roar of the storm, but their voices were fragmented, distant. Emily's vision narrowed, focused entirely on the runway lights now growing larger, brighter. She had to descend carefully, maintain speed, and prepare for touchdown. One miscalculation, one hesitation, and the aircraft could stall or spin out. The plane lurched again. Emily pulled back slightly on the yoke to stabilize, then nudged the throttle. The aircraft responded slowly, painfully, but it responded. She glanced at the airspeed indicator. Too fast. She eased back. Too slow. She nudged forward. The glider-like balance of the plane demanded constant micro-adjustments. She whispered to herself, her voice shaking, "Steady, steady, you can do this." Then came the worst moment yet. A violent gust of wind struck the right wing. The plane tipped dangerously. Red warning lights flashed across the panel. Smoke drifted from the left engine vent. Emily's stomach dropped. She pulled back on the yoke, twisting the rudder pedals, trying to stabilize the aircraft. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. The plane groaned, responded slowly, teetered, then corrected. For a moment, it felt like the storm itself had recognized her determination and tested her resolve. The runway was closer now. Emily's eyes widened at the lights, focusing intently. She had to line up perfectly or the plane could overshoot, or worse. She adjusted flaps, nudged the throttle, and slowly lowered the nose to begin the final approach. The plane shuddered violently as turbulence threatened to push it off course. Emily's heart raced. Every movement, every adjustment, every breath counted. Passengers clutched each other, silent prayers spilling from their lips. The flight attendants braced themselves, shouting for passengers to remain seated. Emily could feel the full weight of their hope pressing against her shoulders. She swallowed, wiped sweat from her eyes, and focused entirely on the runway lights. They were close, closer than she dared imagine. A sudden lurch nearly threw her from the pilot's seat. Emily gritted her teeth and held on, correcting instantly. The plane stabilized just enough to continue. The engines groaned in protest, the left one sputtering faintly. She nudged the throttle on the right, trying to compensate, and felt the aircraft slowly level. Her heart pounded in her chest. One more correction. One more. The runway was only miles away. The storm was still raging. The engines were unstable. The passengers were terrified, clinging to life. Emily's fingers shook as she made minor adjustments, keeping the plane level, maintaining speed, and ensuring the descent remained controlled. Her mind raced, calculating every move, anticipating every gust of wind. And then, as she focused on the runway lights, the plane shuddered violently once more. The left engine coughed and went silent. Emily's stomach sank. The right engine groaned under pressure. The aircraft tilted slightly, threatening to spin. The storm was relentless. Time seemed to stretch into infinity. Her voice barely above a whisper, Emily muttered, "I've got this. I have to have this." She clenched the yoke, heart hammering. Outside, the storm battered the fuselage. Below, the runway lights flickered in the rain. The aircraft trembled, teetering on the edge of control. Every passenger's life rested in the hands of a 17-year-old girl in row 17. And in that tense, terrifying instant, Emily realized the true test wasn't the descent, the storm, or the failing engines. It was the final, impossible challenge, bringing the plane safely to the ground. The runway lights stretched beneath Emily's eyes like a lifeline, fragile and distant, flickering against the sheets of rain. The aircraft shuddered under the relentless storm, each gust of wind a warning, each vibration a threat. She gritted her teeth, fingers white-knuckled on the yoke, eyes darting between instruments and horizon. Every micro-movement mattered. Every adjustment was a gamble. One miscalculation, one hesitation, could send the plane into an uncontrolled spin or worse, a crash. Passengers clutched armrests, eyes wide with terror, some whispering prayers, others frozen in disbelief. Flight attendants shouted instructions, their voices trembling but resolute, urging families to brace. Emily stole a glance at them through the cockpit glass. They were relying on her, trusting a 17-year-old girl to perform a miracle. That weight pressed heavily against her chest, yet it fueled a fire within her. She couldn't fail, not now. The left engine had gone silent, its sputtering final. Smoke trailed faintly from the vent, curling like a warning. The right engine groaned, laboring under the load, but it held. Emily adjusted the throttle, coaxing it to compensate while nudging the yoke to keep the plane level. The runway was approaching, illuminated like a fragile thread through the storm. Each second stretched, long and tense, like hours, and Emily's mind raced through calculations of descent, speed, and glide slope. The turbulence intensified. The plane lurched violently, throwing a small bag down the aisle and eliciting screams from the cabin. Children cried, parents clutched them tightly, and flight attendants struggled to maintain order. Emily's stomach knotted, but she forced herself to focus. She had to compartmentalize, ignore the fear, ignore the chaos, and guide the plane with precision. Failure was not an option. Lightning flashed, illuminating the stormy sky and briefly revealing the wet, glimmering runway. Emily adjusted the yoke, nudged the rudder pedals, and coaxed the flaps into position. The plane responded sluggishly, fighting gravity, wind, and mechanical strain. She forced herself to breathe, focusing on every detail: the angle of descent, the airspeed, the tilt of the wings, and the approaching runway. Each moment required perfect balance between instinct and calculation. The plane lurched again, pitching slightly as turbulence pushed against it. Emily corrected instinctively, adjusting the throttle and yoke with micro-movements. The fuselage vibrated violently and the cabin erupted into panic. A child screamed, a mother sobbed, flight attendants shouted commands, all blending into a symphony of fear. Emily's mind went into hyperfocus, filtering out the chaos, her entire being centered on the aircraft's response. Through the storm, she glimpsed the runway closer now, the lights growing larger, clearer, but still distorted by rain and turbulence. The approach required delicate precision. Too fast and the plane would overshoot, too slow and it could stall. She nudged the throttle carefully, balancing the failing right engine, adjusting flaps and keeping the wings level. Sweat stung her eyes, but she refused to blink. Every instrument, every gust of wind, every vibration demanded constant vigilance. Suddenly the plane shuddered violently, tipping slightly to the right. Emily's stomach lurched as she fought to regain stability. Red warning lights flashed across the cockpit, sirens blaring. She adjusted the yoke, nudged the rudder, and coaxed the plane back into alignment. The engines groaned under strain. Her fingers were numb from the tension, her arms burning from the effort. Outside, the storm showed no mercy, rain lashing against the windows like 1,000 tiny knives. She glanced at the passengers. Faces pale, eyes wide, hands gripping armrests. Some prayed silently. Others whispered urgent encouragements to children clinging to them. Flight attendants braced against the chaos, shouting instructions, holding on to the hope that Emily could deliver them safely. She swallowed hard, forcing her racing heartbeat into focus. 1 second at a time. One correction at a time. The runway was within reach, but the storm and failing engines made the landing feel impossible. Another violent gust struck the fuselage, rocking the plane violently. Emily fought to maintain control, micro-adjusting the yoke, nudging the rudder, balancing throttle. The aircraft trembled, wings tilting dangerously. A tray table fell onto a passenger, a scream pierced the cabin. Sweat poured down Emily's face, stinging her eyes. She blinked it away, eyes locked on the instruments and the approaching runway. The plane shuddered again, then slowly stabilized. She allowed herself a brief, fragile flicker of hope. The engines groaned. The fuselage vibrated. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the runway in stark white. Emily adjusted the flaps, nudged the throttle, and began a cautious descent. The turbulence was relentless, each movement of the aircraft a challenge to her concentration and courage. Her mind calculated every angle, every speed, every adjustment. She whispered to herself, "You can do this. You have to." As the plane descended, the runway lights became more visible, though distorted by the rain. Emily felt the first real sense of proximity to salvation, and the first real surge of fear. She had stabilized the plane enough to approach, but the final moments were treacherous. The engines could fail completely, the storm could push her off course, and the glide slope was perilously narrow. Every passenger's life depended on her ability to maintain control. Suddenly, the right engine sputtered violently, coughing under the strain. Emily's stomach dropped. She adjusted the throttle, coaxing it to maintain power, but the plane pitched dangerously. Panic threatened to seize her, but she forced herself to focus. The storm seemed to intensify with malicious intent, wind gusting, turbulence rocking the aircraft. She whispered a desperate prayer, her eyes glued to the runway lights growing ever closer. The aircraft lurched again, throwing Emily forward slightly. Her hands gripped the yoke tighter, knuckles white. She nudged the rudder pedals, adjusted flaps, and coaxed the plane into alignment. Passengers screamed as the cabin shook violently, but Emily's mind was singularly focused. Line up the runway, maintain speed, and prepare for landing. One misstep could be catastrophic. One hesitation could mean death. Lightning struck nearby, the thunder rattling the fuselage. Rain lashed the windows, obscuring visibility. Emily's pulse raced, her arms burning from holding the controls. The runway was close enough that she could make out the wet asphalt glinting through the storm. She adjusted the flaps, nudged the throttle carefully, and slowly lowered the nose, preparing for the first contact with the ground. The plane trembled, wings teetering against the wind. A violent gust struck the right wing. The plane tipped dangerously. Emily corrected instinctively, nudging the yoke and adjusting throttle. The cabin erupted with screams, hands gripping tightly, hearts pounding. Sweat poured down Emily's face, stinging her eyes. She blinked it away, focusing entirely on the instruments, the runway, and the subtle vibrations through the yoke. Each second was a battle, each movement a test of courage and skill. She whispered, "Steady, steady," the plane leveled momentarily. The runway lights grew closer, brighter. The engines groaned but held. Emily forced herself to remain calm, micro-adjusting flaps, throttle, and rudder. She could feel the weight of every life in the cabin pressing down on her shoulders, but it also strengthened her resolve. She had come this far. She would not fail now. And then, as the runway drew nearer, another violent lurch threw the plane sideways. Emily's stomach dropped. A red warning light blinked furiously, one engine now barely functional. The plane tilted, threatening to spin. Cabin screams rose into a crescendo. Flight attendants shouted instructions, bracing for impact. Emily clenched her jaw, gritted her teeth, and forced the aircraft back into alignment. The runway was just ahead, but the storm, the failing engines, and the chaos inside the cabin made landing feel impossibly dangerous. Her fingers shook on the yoke, her arms burning from the effort. Sweat ran into her eyes. Passengers were terrified, clinging to each other. Flight attendants braced for impact. Emily's heart pounded. She whispered again, "I can do this. I have to." The plane shuddered violently, nose dipping slightly. Every second stretched into eternity. The runway was within reach, but disaster lurked in every gust of wind, every vibration, every failing warning light. And in that heart-stopping instant, Emily understood the truth. The most dangerous part wasn't just the descent, it was the landing itself. Every life on board depended on her next move. The runway lights stretched before Emily like a fragile promise, shimmering through sheets of rain that hammered the plane relentlessly. The aircraft trembled violently with every gust of wind, and her knuckles ached from gripping the yoke. Her heart raced as adrenaline coursed through her veins, every nerve screaming that one mistake could end in disaster. She whispered to herself, "Stay calm, focus. You can do this." Passengers clutched seatbelts, wide-eyed with fear. Children whimpered into their parents' shoulders. Mothers and fathers whispered frantic prayers, hopping against hope. Flight attendants struggled to maintain calm in the chaos, shouting instructions while their own hands shook. Emily stole a glance through the cockpit window, seeing the terror reflected in every face. The weight of responsibility threatened to crush her, but it also lit a fire in her soul. She couldn't fail. She wouldn't. The left engine was dead. Smoke trailed faintly from its vent, a bitter reminder of the fragility of their situation. The right engine groaned under strain, laboring to keep the plane aloft. Emily nudged the throttle carefully, coaxing it to maintain thrust, while simultaneously nudging the yoke to keep the wings level. The plane responded slowly, sluggishly, but it responded. Each tiny success was a battle won against the storm, gravity, and failing systems. She adjusted the flaps, lowering them gradually for landing, monitoring the descent with precision. The runway lights grew brighter closer, but the turbulence was relentless. The plane pitched violently, throwing passengers forward. Emily fought to maintain control, nudging the rudder pedals, adjusting the yoke, balancing the throttle. She could feel the strain in her arms, the burn in her muscles, but she refused to let go. Every second was a life-or-death decision. Lightning flashed, illuminating the runway in stark white, and for a moment the chaos outside froze her in awe and terror. Thunder followed, shaking the plane violently. Emily adjusted the plane's pitch to compensate, feeling the vibrations through the fuselage, sensing the pull of wind and rain. The right engine groaned again, threatening to falter. Her stomach twisted. She couldn't fail, not now, not when salvation was within reach. The first descent brought them closer to the runway, and Emily carefully nudged the throttle forward, coaxing the plane to maintain just enough speed. She adjusted flaps and rudder, micromanaging every movement. The plane responded, but the turbulence pushed against her corrections, tilting the aircraft dangerously. Cabin screams rose, passengers clinging desperately to armrests. Flight attendants braced themselves, shouting for calm, holding on to the fragile hope that Emily could guide them safely. The first near touchdown came suddenly. Emily had aligned the aircraft perfectly, or as perfectly as humanly possible under the circumstances. The plane's wheels kissed the wet asphalt, but the right engine's failing thrust and the storm's violent gusts caused the aircraft to lurch violently. Passengers screamed, gripping each other. The plane bounced, threatening to tip, to skid, to roll. Emily's hands flew over the yoke, correcting with desperate precision. She adjusted the throttle, nudged the yoke, and coaxed the plane back onto the runway. Sparks flew from the landing gear as the tires scraped against the rain-slick asphalt. Rain pelted the cockpit windows, blinding her momentarily. The aircraft shuddered under the violent force of the storm, wings tilting dangerously. Emily's stomach dropped as she fought to stabilize the plane. One more misstep, one delayed correction, and disaster would strike. The passengers' screams mixed with the roar of the storm and the groaning engines. A child cried out, clinging to a parent's shoulder. Flight attendants shouted instructions, their voices trembling. Emily's mind narrowed, focused entirely on the instruments, the runway, the subtle vibrations through the yoke. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes, but she refused to blink. The landing demanded total attention, total control, and absolute courage. Another violent gust struck the right wing, forcing the aircraft sideways. Emily reacted instantly, adjusting the rudder and nudging the yoke to keep the plane aligned. The wheels struck the asphalt again, skidding slightly, bouncing over puddles. Sparks flew, smoke curled faintly from the tires. Passengers screamed. Flight attendants braced, holding on to hope. Emily felt every vibration, every resistance, every subtle pull of wind, translating it into micro-adjustments. The plane responded slowly, but remained on the runway. The storm seemed relentless, testing her at every turn. Lightning split the sky, thunder rattled the fuselage, rain lashed the windows. Emily adjusted flaps, nudged the throttle, maintained a delicate balance between airspeed and descent. The runway lights were a beacon now, guiding her through the chaos. The plane's wheels scraped and bounced, but she coaxed it forward, maintaining alignment. Every second felt like an eternity, every movement life or death. Passengers held their breath, gripping each other, whispering prayers. Flight attendants shouted reassurance, their own faces pale with tension. Emily's arms burned from the effort of keeping the plane steady, her fingers white-knuckled on the yoke. The right engine groaned, threatening to fail completely. The aircraft teetered slightly, tilting with the next gust of wind. She nudged the rudder, adjusted the throttle, coaxing the plane to remain on course. A violent shudder threw her forward. The wheels scraped the runway hard, bouncing, threatening to lose control. Emily's stomach twisted. She could hear the passengers' screams, the creak of the fuselage under stress, the roar of the storm outside. She whispered to herself, "You can do this. You must do this." She corrected instantly, nudging the yoke, adjusting the rudder, coaxing the plane back onto the center line. The landing gear trembled, sparks flying from contact with the wet runway. The plane bounced again, threatening to veer off course. Emily fought to maintain control, adjusting every micro-angle, nudging the throttle, guiding the fuselage with precision. Sweat ran down her face, stinging her eyes. Her arms ached, her heart raced. Every second was a battle. Every adjustment was a gamble. The passengers' lives rested entirely on her skill. Finally, for a brief, fragile moment, the plane's wheels touched and held. The aircraft skidded slightly, then stabilized. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Passengers clutched each other, whispering prayers of relief. Flight attendants braced, glancing at Emily with a mix of awe and disbelief. But Emily knew better than to celebrate. The landing was only partially complete. The storm raged, engines groaned, and the plane still required careful guidance to come to a complete stop. The runway stretched before them, a slick ribbon of light amidst the storm. Emily's fingers remained steady on the yoke, her mind calculating every micro-adjustment, every subtle correction. The right engine's groaning intensified. Sparks flew from the tires with each skid. Rain continued to lash the windows. The plane teetered on the edge of control, every moment a battle against nature and failing machinery. She whispered to herself, "Almost there, steady, you can do this." The plane shuddered again, the wheels skidding slightly. She nudged the throttle, adjusted flaps, coaxed the rudder, and slowly guided the plane toward a full stop. Each micro-adjustment required perfection. One lapse could send the plane spinning off the runway, sliding into disaster. Every passenger's life was a thread she was holding together with skill, instinct, and courage. And as the plane gradually slowed, Emily felt a flicker of hope, a fragile sense of survival. But the storm was relentless. The engines groaned. Rain continued to pelt the fuselage. Sparks from the tires illuminated the cabin momentarily. She knew that the first touchdown had been achieved, but the plane still had to stop completely amidst the chaos. Every second remained critical. The runway lights stretched ahead, beckoning. Emily maintained control, micro-adjusting, guiding the plane with the precision of instinct and adrenaline. Passengers whispered prayers, some crying in relief, others staring in disbelief at the teenager who had taken control of their lives. Flight attendants glanced at her, faces pale but awestruck. She could feel the tension of every life on board pressing down on her shoulders, but she refused to falter. And then, just as she began to coax the plane toward a gradual stop, another violent gust struck, threatening to push the aircraft off course. Emily's stomach lurched. Every instinct screamed danger. Every warning light screamed urgency. She gritted her teeth, adjusted the yoke and rudder, nudged the throttle, and coaxed the plane into final alignment. The storm was merciless, but her resolve was absolute. For a heart-stopping moment, everything balanced on the edge of disaster: the failing engines, the raging storm, the trembling passengers, and a 17-year-old girl in row 17 guiding them all. The rain slammed against the windshield, hammering like 1,000 fists, each drop magnifying the tension in Emily's chest. The runway stretched out beneath her, a slick ribbon of light reflecting the chaos above and around. The first touchdown had been made, but the storm and the failing engines refused to relent. Every second was critical. Every movement could decide the fate of the passengers. Emily's arms burned from the effort of holding the yoke steady. Her knuckles were white, sweat dripping into her eyes, blurring her vision. She wiped it away with the back of her sleeve, refusing to take her eyes off the runway. The plane shuddered under the violent gusts, rocking from side to side, wings threatening to tilt dangerously. Her stomach churned with a mix of fear and adrenaline. One mistake now, and all their lives could be lost. The right engine groaned, straining under the weight of the aircraft. Sparks flew from the wheels as they scraped along the wet asphalt. Emily nudged the throttle carefully, coaxing the engine to maintain just enough power, while adjusting the yoke and rudder to counter the wind. The aircraft responded sluggishly, fighting against gravity, turbulence, and the relentless storm. Inside the cabin, passengers clutched armrests, children sobbing, parents whispering prayers. Flight attendants shouted instructions, bracing themselves while keeping terrified passengers calm. Emily stole a glance through the cockpit window, seeing the fear and hope reflected in every face. The responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a weight she had never experienced before, but it also lit an unbreakable resolve. She had to stop this plane safely. She had to save them. Another violent gust slammed against the fuselage, tilting the plane dangerously. Emily reacted instantly, nudging the yoke, adjusting the rudder and coaxing the aircraft back onto the center line. The runway was still slick with rain, and the plane shuddered under the weight of its momentum. Sparks flew from the tires again as they scraped across puddles on the runway. Her heart pounded in her chest. The plane was responding, but barely. She adjusted the flaps, nudged the throttle, and attempted to slow the aircraft gradually. The storm's fury seemed to mock her efforts, gusts rocking the plane violently from side to side. Passengers screamed, gripping their loved ones, while flight attendants shouted reassurances over the chaos. Emily's mind was hyper-focused, filtering out everything except the instruments, the runway, and the delicate balance required to bring the aircraft to a stop. A bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the storm in harsh white light. Thunder followed, rattling the fuselage violently. Emily's stomach dropped. The plane lurched again, tilting to the right. The wheels skidded slightly on the slick surface, sparks flying. She adjusted the yoke, nudged the rudder pedals, and coaxed the aircraft back into alignment. The right engine groaned under strain, threatening to fail completely. Sweat poured down her face, blurring her vision. Her arms ached from the effort. The runway seemed endless, a lifeline she couldn't afford to lose. Emily's mind raced, calculating every micro-movement, the angle of descent, the speed, the balance of throttle and flaps. Every correction had to be perfect, or the plane could skid off the runway, spinning into disaster. The tension inside the cockpit was suffocating. She whispered to herself, "Steady, steady, you can do this." Another gust of wind slammed into the right wing, tilting the plane dangerously. Emily's stomach lurched. The aircraft shuddered, skidding slightly on the wet asphalt. She adjusted the rudder, nudged the yoke, coaxed the plane back onto the runway. The passengers screamed, clutching each other in terror. Flight attendants braced against the chaos. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. One more miscalculation, one delayed reaction, and they could all be gone. The right engine sputtered violently, smoke curling faintly from the vent. Emily's stomach dropped. The plane's speed needed to be reduced, but the engine's instability made it nearly impossible. She adjusted flaps carefully, nudged the throttle, and guided the plane along the runway with painstaking precision. Each micro-adjustment was a battle against physics, wind, and failing machinery. The passengers held their breath, feeling the terror and determination radiating from the cockpit. Sparks flew again as the wheels skidded across puddles, tires grinding against wet asphalt. Emily adjusted the yoke, nudged the rudder, and slowly coaxed the aircraft into a gradual slowdown. The storm raged, wind gusting violently, rain blinding the windows. Her arms burned, her hands ached, and her heart raced like a drum in her chest. But she refused to give up. She couldn't, not now. She glanced at the passengers briefly, seeing faces etched with terror, hope, and disbelief. Children clutched parents' shoulders, whispering prayers. Flight attendants shouted reassurance, bracing for impact while hopping for salvation. Emily's mind was laser-focused on the instruments and the runway. Every micro-correction mattered. Every second counted. She whispered again, "Almost there, steady, just a little further." The plane teetered slightly as another gust hit, threatening to push it off course. Emily reacted instantly, nudging the yoke, adjusting rudder, coaxing the aircraft back onto the center line. Sparks flew as the wheels scraped the wet asphalt again. The right engine groaned, straining under the load. Sweat stung her eyes, mixing with tears of exhaustion and adrenaline. The plane shuddered violently, passengers screaming, but Emily's determination did not waver. She adjusted flaps again, nudged the throttle, and slowly coaxed the aircraft forward. The runway lights stretched beneath them like a lifeline, flickering through the storm. The plane responded gradually, the wheels beginning to grip the wet surface more securely. Emily's heart raced. She knew she was close, but the storm, the failing engines, and the slick runway left no room for error. Every second was a fight for survival. Another violent gust rocked the fuselage. The plane tilted dangerously to the right, the wings threatening to lift against the wind. Emily gritted her teeth, adjusted the yoke, nudged the rudder pedals, and coaxed the plane back onto the runway. Sparks flew from the tires, smoke curling faintly. The passengers screamed, gripping each other in terror. Flight attendants braced against the chaos, shouting encouragements. Emily's arms burned, but she refused to relent. Finally, slowly, painstakingly, the plane began to decelerate more steadily. The right engine groaned but held. The wheels gripped the wet runway. Sparks diminished. Rain still lashed the fuselage, wind gusted, and the storm raged, but Emily maintained control. Passengers began to exhale, some whispering prayers of relief. Flight attendants exchanged astonished glances. Emily's heart pounded, adrenaline coursing through her veins, but she knew better than to relax. The runway stretched ahead, the end approaching. Emily continued micro-adjustments, nudging yoke and throttle, coaxing the plane to a complete stop. The wheels screeched against the wet asphalt, the fuselage shuddered, and the engines protested, but gradually the aircraft slowed. The storm still raged, but for the first time, a fragile sense of control emerged. And then finally, after what felt like an eternity, the aircraft ground to a full, stable stop. Emily's hands trembled on the yoke. The right engine groaned one last time, then fell silent. The plane was still. The storm howled around them, but the runway beneath them was solid. Inside the cabin, a collective sigh of relief rose, mingled with tears, whispers, and prayers. Children clung to their parents, sobbing quietly. Flight attendants slumped against rails, shaking but alive. Emily's chest heaved, arms numb, sweat and tears streaming down her face. She had done it. Against impossible odds, she had brought the plane to a full stop. She had saved them all. And as silence descended over the wet runway, broken only by the storm outside, Emily realized that the true test wasn't over. There would be questions, investigations, and accolades. But in this moment, she allowed herself a fragile, trembling acknowledgement. She had survived. They had survived. The storm still raged above, rain pelting the runway in relentless sheets, but the aircraft was finally still. Emily's arms trembled, fingers numb from gripping the yoke for what felt like an eternity. Her chest heaved, heart pounding like a drum. She could barely process the enormity of what had just happened. She had landed the plane. Not just any plane, but a fully loaded passenger jet in the middle of a violent storm, with one engine dead and the other barely holding on. Inside the cabin, the tension shattered. Passengers erupted into sobs, laughter, and prayerful murmurs of relief. Children clutched their parents, some unable to stop shaking. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, helping the shaken, checking for injuries, and offering quiet reassurances. For a moment, everyone forgot the storm outside, lost in the shared relief of survival. And then the word began to circulate quietly, spreading like wildfire. Row 17, the girl in row 17. She landed the plane. Emily lowered her hands from the yoke, her body trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. She dared a glance at the passengers through the cockpit glass. Faces pressed to windows, eyes wide in awe. Some were whispering her name, some weeping openly, some simply staring in disbelief. She had been a passenger just minutes ago, a teenager caught in an impossible situation. Now she was the reason they were alive. Flight attendants cautiously entered the cockpit, eyes wide with awe. One placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, trembling. You saved us," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. Emily's lips trembled. Words failed her. She had no rehearsed heroic speech, no manual for this. She simply nodded, feeling a mix of relief, disbelief, and overwhelming exhaustion. She had done it. She had survived, and she had saved everyone aboard. Emergency crews were already on the tarmac, storm gear-clad men and women racing toward the plane. Sirens wailed in the distance, lights flashing through sheets of rain. Emily's heart skipped a beat. They were alive, but now the chaos of post-landing procedures had begun. She assisted the flight attendants in securing the cabin, helping passengers prepare to exit safely. Every movement was careful, deliberate, as if she was still controlling the plane itself. As the passengers began disembarking, the reality of what had happened started to settle in. Strangers hugged, tears streaming down faces, gratitude spilling over in quiet words and shaky laughter. One mother, clutching her child, approached Emily, eyes wide with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. You saved our lives." Emily's throat tightened. She nodded, unable to speak. The enormity of the situation weighed heavily on her, yet there was a strange sense of pride, a flicker of understanding that she had performed the impossible. News crews and emergency responders arrived, braving the storm to witness the aftermath. Cameras captured the soaked, trembling teenager emerging from the cockpit, assisting passengers, checking for injuries. Reporters shouted questions over the wind, but Emily barely registered them. Her focus was entirely on the passengers, the crew, and ensuring everyone was safe. Each smile, each tear of gratitude was a reward far greater than any headline could provide. Airline officials arrived, faces grim at first, then slowly softening as they assessed the situation. They spoke quickly, asking questions, reviewing the logs and confirming the details. And then, almost hesitantly, one of them turned to Emily. You landed this plane," he said. His voice was a mixture of disbelief and awe. Emily nodded, swallowing hard, feeling her chest tight. I tried," she whispered. "I just had to." The storm had not yet passed, but for the first time in hours there was a sense of calm, fragile and shimmering. Passengers were safe, the aircraft was intact, and a young girl who had been a passenger just moments ago had become a hero. The emergency crews offered congratulations, but also checked for injuries. Emily's body shook, not from cold, but from the sheer adrenaline crash and relief. She had done it. Against impossible odds, she had brought everyone home. As the storm began to ease slightly, whispers spread through the crowd. Social media posts, phone cameras capturing her soaked, exhausted form. Within minutes, news outlets were broadcasting her story. Teenager lands passenger jet in storm, saves everyone on board. Emily's life would never be the same. She had become a symbol of courage, calm under pressure, and impossible heroism. Flight attendants, once professional and formal, now embraced her, tears mingling with rain. "I've never seen anything like it," one said. "You didn't just save lives, you gave hope." Emily's lips trembled into a faint smile. Hope. She had given them hope. It felt surreal. The adrenaline that had driven her for hours now melted into exhaustion, shaking through every fiber of her body. Passengers approached her cautiously, some asking for photos, others simply whispering thanks. One elderly man, gripping her hand with trembling fingers, said, "I don't know what we would have done without you. God bless you." Emily blinked back tears. She had been terrified, unsure if she could control the plane, unsure if she would survive. And now, faced with the tangible gratitude of the people she had saved, a wave of emotion overwhelmed her. Later, as officials and emergency personnel completed their procedures, Emily was escorted off the plane. She stepped onto the wet tarmac, exhausted, drenched and shaking. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. And somewhere amid the chaos, she realized she wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was a symbol. A 17-year-old girl who had stepped into the cockpit at 30,000 feet, guided a failing aircraft through a violent storm, and saved every life on board. Her parents arrived moments later, running through the rain, shouting her name. Emily turned, tears streaming, and collapsed into their arms. "I was so scared," she whispered. Her father held her tightly, voice trembling. "I know, but you did it. You saved them all. You were amazing." The relief and pride in their voices wrapped around her like a warm blanket. She had survived, she had triumphed, and the impossible had been made real. News crews caught every moment. The trembling girl, the relieved passengers, the emotional reunion with her family. Social media exploded with hashtags: Row 17 Hero, Teen Pilot, Miracle Landing. Emily's story spread across the nation, inspiring millions. She became a symbol of courage, presence of mind, and the extraordinary power of determination. And through it all, she remained humble, still shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion, still processing the reality of what had just happened. Later, as she sat quietly in a waiting room, wrapped in a blanket, Emily reflected on the events. She had been terrified, untrained, and completely unprepared for the situation she had faced. But in those moments above 30,000 feet, when the engines failed and the storm raged, she had found something she hadn't known existed: an unwavering focus, a determination to act, and the courage to confront the impossible. She had discovered her own strength and saved lives in the process. The passengers would never forget her. The crew would never forget her. And Emily, once a teenager in row 17, would never forget the day she became a hero. Even as the storm cleared, leaving a soaked but intact plane and a shaken yet safe group of passengers, Emily knew that the memory of that night, the fear, the adrenaline, the impossible choices, and the ultimate triumph would remain with her forever. She had faced the impossible and emerged victorious. And somewhere in the quiet aftermath, she allowed herself a single thought: I was just a passenger, but today I was everything they needed.